Good morning, everybody, or indeed good afternoon, depending where you are in the world. Welcome to this little webinar for 30-45 minutes about process safety leadership and corporate responsibility. My name's Andy Fowler at Sigma-HSE, process safety consultancy and test house for these sorts of things. So we'll hopefully you can see my screen okay and everything's working fine and you can hear me. If not, just stick something in the chat box and we can try and fix that as we go. So just a little bit of an advertisement really for Sigma, just a little bit background about me. I'm currently the Technical and Operations Director at Sigma-HSE. My background, I'm a chemist who's been heavily involved in the chemical manufacturing industry for many years before I then joined the UK's Health and Safety Executive as a process safety specialist inspector and risk assessor, where I was very heavily involved in development of the UK legislation around COMA, which is the COMA regulations, control of major accident hazard regulations in the UK that enact the European Seveso directive. So that's the process safety legislation that we work under within Europe. So heavily involved in that, in setting the regulations, and lots of experience of seeing different processes and so on and so forth. And I've also been for the last 12 years in consultancy, specifically dealing with process safety management. And one of the things I'd like to share with you today, the reason why I'm on this webinar, is I've spent the last decade, well, more than a decade now, providing training on process safety management and process safety leadership. And I'd like to share some of my experiences with what I've found from doing that work and indeed doing process safety management audits, both of management systems and operating process plants. So I'm getting on in years now, so I'm getting close to 40 years experience in process safety management, so I should know a little bit these days. Okay, so I'm your speaker for today. Just to highlight, Sigma-HSE is a bespoke process safety management consultancy, but we all with offices in the UK and in India, but we also have the luxury of testing houses where we can do a lot of testing around process technologies, whether that's flammability testing of vapors and gases or powders or chemical reaction hazard analyses and all of these sorts of things, and indeed provide training. And then of course we've got the consultancy side of the business where our experts can lead you, on what those results from those testings can mean, what you need to do on your process plant and so on and so forth. So a great deal of expertise, global coverage, where you can see on that slide where we have our offices. So we've got consultancy services, all focused towards process safety management and all aspects of process safety management, whether that's functional safety or doing HAZOPs or LOPAs or lots of other good things that are needed. And we've also got the test houses where we can actually probe what's going on within chemical reaction hazard assessments or indeed the properties of substances. So we have a lot of expertise to offer out there on this sort of topic. But today, what I'd like to give you is my experience of where process safety leadership and management is these days, and in fact, where I think the issues from a business perspective, where we still need some improvement. Now, and I'll be looking at that from some primary focuses of understanding what we understand about our processes, whether those are our management systems or our physical manufacturing processes or whatever. and linking that with our behaviours and leadership principles that are out there. And what I'd like you to do is, when I'm talking, is to think about, well, how do we do that on our site? Do we do it well, or do we not do it well? What's our drivers for doing process safety well? Because process safety is a complex subject. There's an awful lot within it to get right. It requires an awful lot of resource, and a lot of that resource is very technically focused. But of course, from a business perspective, we've got to have that leadership, we've got to have that commitment to do the right things. The problem with process safety, one of the major problems with process safety is, of course, process safety by definition is trying to prevent major events, disasters, catastrophes, you know, big fires, big explosions, toxic releases, things that have got the potential to do an awful lot of damage. We can either, you know, we can significantly pollute the environment. We can kill lots of people. We have the potential to kill lots of people with these sorts of events. And in fact, you only have to look at the history of companies that have had these major disasters. It's got a nasty habit of wiping businesses out as well. So it really is something that businesses need to focus on and to manage well. But it's a difficult task to do. It really is a real big bag of string that needs untangling and drawing together to do well. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is just take you through, you know, just what is process safety, because the problem with process safety is these big events, these disasters, don't happen very often. They're very rare. It's still fair to say that most of us can be in our industry working for our 40 years and not come face to face with one of these major events. Okay, but they do happen. And I guess the latest one that happened last year was over in Beirut, where we had the ammonium nitrate explosion. And undoubtedly, you will have all have seen that in the press and the media and the TV and everything else at the time of it. So this is where process safety is focused. But these events are rare. And when you get into looking at the level of risk from your processes, particularly if you have the potential for major incidents, because process safety is all about making decisions based upon the level of risk. So undoubtedly, there'll be some element of risk analysis in there, where you're calculating the level of risk for these bad things from happening. But then you're getting very low levels of risk. And I sort of have a little analogy with this. It's like winning the lottery jackpot. Okay, so you know that risk is a combination of the consequences of something bad happening and its likelihood. Okay, so the consequences of winning that jackpot are very serious in a way. It's life-changing amounts of money. Okay, it has a significant impact on your life going forward. But the likelihood of winning it is very low. In the UK, with our lottery a few years ago, before they changed the rules, the risk, the likelihood of winning that jackpot lottery, that lottery jackpot each week was 1 in 14 million per year. Now, you know, that sounds a low level of risk, but it's a bit hard for most people to compute what that means. Well, if I give you a little analogy, that's 1 in 14 million per year risk is the same as if you were a man living in the UK and you were aged over 40 and you bought your lottery ticket at noon on Saturday. You're actually more likely to have died from a heart attack by the time that jackpot lottery draw is made at 8 p.m. on Saturday evening than you are of winning that jackpot. So it's a very low likelihood, but most weeks somebody wins that jackpot. And process safety really is trying to avoid, doing our best not to win that jackpot. Okay, and there's a lot of effort needed to do that, because if we do win the jackpot, if we do have one of these large events, it could well put our business, so the business doesn't exist anymore, and all the employees are out of work and so on and so forth. So to be able to do process safety management, we can essentially, we need to answer 3 questions. Do we understand what can go wrong? Do we really understand what can happen if we lose control of our processes? You know, is it a very small fire, or is it a fire that is extremely large, or an explosion like a Beirut explosion? Okay, do we really understand what can go wrong? Because if we don't understand that, clearly we're not going to be able to manage it and to prevent those things from happening very well. And the second question we've got to ask ourselves is, well, what have we got within our business to stop these bad things from going wrong? Okay, so we'll put in place measures to manage the level of risk. So we'll have items of equipment or special things that we do in terms of special tasks to manage that level of risk. But of course, those measures, those protective measures, we need to make sure that those measures, if they're called upon to work to stop these events from happening tomorrow, they will in fact be effective. And these 3 simple little questions are very useful, because they're only 3 simple little questions. So you can use them when you're walking around your site. You can use them when you're talking to your colleagues and your managers and your leaders to gauge the understanding. Do people understand what can go wrong? Do they know what they've got to protect them? And how do we know that they're likely to work if called upon to work? Yeah. And if you were to delve into the legislation that's out there, or indeed the guidelines, like in the UK, we have the Energy Institute that produces guidelines on how to manage process safety. And in America, we have the CCPS, Center for Chemical Process Safety Guidelines. There's lots of guidance out there. And they're all effectively, in the legislation as well, so all effectively is answering these 3 questions. Whether that's what you need to do within a business or what the regulator requires, it doesn't really matter. It's just the level of proportionality that needs to be put into these answering these 3 questions. So of course, understanding what can go wrong is key. Process safety legislation, process safety guidance that's out there is all around getting a grip on the level of risk, understanding risk. And of course, risk is this combination of the consequences of a hazard, whether that be sources of high energy or dangerous substances, and the likelihood of that consequence coming about. So, you know, identifying our hazards is a key stage in understanding this question, because if we fail to understand a hazard, to identify a hazard, then we won't put in place any measures to be able to manage that hazard going forward within our processes. And as you'll know, there's lots of techniques out there to identify hazards. And one of the key ones being HAZOP itself, hazard and operability studies, as well as hazard identification studies, LOPA, and other things like this. And this is quite commonplace that we will run HAZOP studies, particularly if we're going to do something new, put in a new process plant in or whatever. It's very rare these days that a company won't undertake a HAZOP. But of course, there's lots of information that's needed before we can truly do a good HAZOP and get a grip on this. We need to understand, for instance, what it is we're trying to achieve and what are the properties, what are the hazards that could occur in this process, and how big the problem may be. This is what I term extent and severity. So how big is the hazard and how much harm can it do? So, you know, it's differentiating from a small explosion that doesn't harm anybody to an extremely large explosion that has the potential to kill an awful lot of people or whatever. Okay, so that might involve a lot of work beforehand to feed into studies like the HAZOP. And this is where things like doing chemical reaction hazard assessments, really understanding that although we're trying to make this chemical, if we make maloperations, if we add something at the wrong stage or we add too much of it, just what is the problem? How big is the problem? Now, although you may raise the issue in a HAZOP, a good HAZOP will identify these issues, but without this initial work going forward, it may be difficult to actually answer those questions. So you're becoming, if nothing else, your HAZOP is becoming less efficient. And another thing that I found over my many years of experience, of course, HAZOP is generally done using a 2D representation of your process in terms of a process and instrument diagram, a P&ID, or these sorts of things. And yet, we seem to have got into the habit of not keeping our process and instrument diagrams up to date. We make changes on the plant for all sorts of reasons, but our drawings aren't necessarily updated. When I was a lad in the industry, this was something that you gave to vacation students to do, chemical engineering students, to go out and modify the drawings, to look at the plant and make sure that the 2D representation was correct. We seem to have got out of that HAZOP, out of that habit. Okay, and that of course can be very detrimental, because if we're doing a HAZOP exercise and our drawings aren't correct, then we're vulnerable to the output of the HAZOP being incorrect. Okay, so there's lots of techniques out there, but also the emphasis in process safety is trying to prevent these major events as well. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done prior to going into something like a HAZOP. Okay, in terms of choosing what design you go with, and a lot more emphasis on inherent safety. You know, inherent safety. Can we eliminate the hazard? Can we operate with something which has a lower inherent hazard to it? Okay, and undoubtedly, your systems that you work with on your site, in terms of your management of change procedure, in terms of your risk assessment procedures that you'll operate under, will ask you to do these things, but are they done robustly enough? Do we go further backwards? And I'll give you a little example of this in relation to a client I was working with. Now, this client is an expert in phosphonating various organic materials, and they use phosphine, which is a extremely flammable and toxic gas, to undertake these phosphonations, putting phosphorus into molecules. And of course, they had a sister company elsewhere in the world that made a particular material, and they wanted to make it elsewhere within the group of companies. And so this company, which was based in the UK, said, well, yes, we can do that. We can't do what you do on the existing process, because the existing process used liquid phosphine, which is extremely nasty stuff and can cause significant major incidents if there's loss of containment. So they recognized they couldn't do that, but they did some work to try and use gaseous phosphine, which was the normal way of phosphonating material on the UK site, and they came up with a process design. And they liked this process design because it was relatively cheap to do, because they had the kit available. The reactor sitting there that only needed slight modification. They all had all the other ancillary storage and everything else. So from a business perspective, it was a really good thing to do, okay, and could be done quickly and cheaply. Now, when the regulator got involved, the regulator started asking questions. Well, how much work did you do beforehand looking at alternative options to manufacturing this substance? Are there ways of manufacturing this substance that doesn't use, for example, phosphine, which by definition is capable of major incident because it's an extremely flammable and toxic material? And they weren't able to convince the regulator that they'd gone through that sort of exercise. Their management of change system, which they were employing, didn't prompt the employees to consider such questions. And they got into very deep water with the regulator over this. Not to the point of view that the regulator stopped them from manufacturing this product in the route they wanted, but because they hadn't justified that that was an appropriate way of doing things. So hopefully you can start to see just from that little example of just what sort of level of rigor is needed when we do these things. And of course, this links to an issue that I'll be talking about a bit later, is the drivers within your business. You know, many businesses these days are lean and mean. We're very responsive to the client. If the, you know, we want to be able to satisfy the client very quickly. Yeah, and of course, to do it properly, even to comply with our own procedures within our businesses, you know, doing HAZOPs, putting things through management of change, are not quick processes. They hamper us. And I forget the number of times where a young project manager has given a commitment to a senior leader that this process will be up and running within a few weeks, when literally to do the HAZOP is a few weeks worth of work. So we fall into all of these sorts of traps. Yeah. So understanding what can go wrong is key. Once we do understand what can go wrong, we can put in place measures to prevent, control and mitigate those things from going wrong. And these measures generally reduce the likelihood of the thing going wrong. Some measures will reduce the consequences, but the primary control is over reducing the likelihood. So we'll put measures in place on our plant, like pressure relief valves, like crash cooling systems, whatever they are, to prevent, control or mitigate these things going wrong, because we know that they can go wrong. Or we might have to do special tasks. There may be critical steps within the procedure that need to be done correctly. So we have, by definition, we have items of safety critical equipment installed on our processes, equipment that is specifically there to prevent, control or mitigate these bad things from going wrong that we've said could happen, these large fires, explosions and so on. Okay, once we've got those items of equipment, those safety critical items of equipment, they need to be effective, because ideally these items should never operate. We should have tight enough control over our processes that these items of safety critical equipment never operate. But if they are called upon to operate, they've got to be effective. They've got to prevent, control or mitigate significantly this bad thing. So what happens isn't as bad as it could be. And this is where the management systems come in, because these items of safety critical equipment will only be effective if they've been properly designed. if they're properly constructed and installed, if they're correctly operated and inspected and maintained. It's what's called the process safety life cycle. And that's what the process safety management systems are there for. How do we look after our assets, our permit to work systems, our management of change systems, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, these items of safety critical equipment we've decided we need from our hazard identification and risk assessment procedures that we go through, because they reduce the likelihood of these bad things going wrong. But they'll only reduce the likelihood if in fact they will work, and they'll only be effective and work as we expect them to work if they've been properly designed, they're properly operated and properly maintained, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's our process design. That's what many of you will work with. We'll have this process design. Now, this is the way the system is set up to work, but in fact, there is a precursor to this, which in the UK, the law doesn't really specify, but it's there as what I call a golden rule. Okay, and that is that your process designs should comply with what's called accepted good practice as a minimum. And accepted good practice is generally written down, and it's guidance either from the regulators or from the industry bodies or whatever that sets the minimum standards. Okay, now of course, once you've got standards, almost a rule book, these things can change over time. And it is quite common, even if you've done a HAZOP, many of your procedures will say that every now and then, every 3 or 5 years, you'll essentially do another hazard identification exercise. It's normally called a process hazard analysis, a PHA, like a mini HAZOP, yeah? Because these are done to catch the things that you missed out when you first did your HAZOP. Okay, although a HAZOP's a very robust and methodological approach, it's as good as the people in the room, you know, and it's as good as how fresh their minds are. And again, you know, if we don't identify a hazard, if we don't make sure we've got sufficient measures, we might find that if we ask the same questions in a few years' time, that we find that, well, we didn't deal with this, we haven't dealt with this properly. The reason why I talk about accepted good practice is I find many companies are very forceful at making sure these PHAs are undertaken. The leadership of the business insists that they are done and resources are provided to it. But when you talk to the people who actually do the process hazard analyses, my experience has been that people often say, well, they're not very high quality. And the reason why they're not very high quality is those people are going in with the belief that because the plant's been operating for the past 20 or 30 years and nothing significant has changed, then the PHA is a bit of a tick boxing exercise. The one thing that the PHA team tend not to do, and it's very important, is to ask themselves this one question. If we were building this plant today, how different would it look? And your way of doing that is looking to see if the standards, if the accepted good practice guidance or whatever has changed. So for instance, there's many pieces of old accepted good practice out there for dealing with toxic materials that call for bulk storage of toxic materials to be out in the open air. Okay, so if there is a leak, it can be readily dispersed. That is no longer currently considered accepted good practice. Now we're talking about containing it with scrubber systems and ventilation systems and all of these sorts of things to manage the risks from toxic substances. So to simply say, you know, we're doing a PHA on a system that's handling a toxic gas or whatever, and we're not looking at, well, you know, if we were building it today, it'd look totally different. We aren't really satisfying the law, definitely in the UK, and we're not really satisfying the continuous improvement processes that will be present within your businesses. Okay, which leads us on to the third question of how do we know these protective measures are effective? How do we get a grip on the performance measurement? And of course, these are things that you will take into your PHAs. You know, any incidents or near misses that have occurred on the plant, the output from audits and so on and so forth. And I'll say more about these things a little bit later. Okay, but this third question is basically saying how is the organisation learning? How are we learning to improve? It's linked with continuous improvement. Process safety requires that you do more than simply comply with the law. It requires you to continuously improve, which when you think about it, is a key facet of any business. If a business doesn't continuously improve, it won't be very sustainable going forward. Okay, so there's very key things there. But two important things I want to fetch out from this is, you know, process safety management isn't just engineering. It's this blend of engineering and management skills. Yeah, and they all require humans, whether you're the designer, the operator, or the plant, or whatever. Every stage of this process requires humans. So the way we behave is very critical to doing things correctly. And the thing that drives human behaviour, in a sense, is set by the leadership. So there's got to be a commitment to do the right thing, and that's set by the leaders. Okay, and of course, for them to be able to do the right things, they've got to understand what can go wrong. They've got to understand the measures that are in place. They've got to understand what the performance monitoring is telling them and act accordingly. Okay, and this is why there's such a big push to leaders. As humans, we are still very much pack animals. We will look to our leaders for direction. Yeah, and if we can have the systems, we can have the management systems that prompt us to do things in certain ways, but if the leaders sidetrack those systems, or you know, they're very focused towards production rate rather than safety, we know what's important to them, and what's important to them will become the standard for why it's important to us. So we've got to have this commitment of the leadership. And clearly, if you look at the Baker panel findings from the BP Texas City event, and in essence onto the Buncefield event that happened in the UK back in 2005, and in fact, when we get the findings from the Beirut disaster in time as we go forward, we'll find that it's the same sort of failings. There's very, very little new in process safety. We have the events, we do good investigations, we get the root causes, but there's very little that's new that comes out of it. We've got very few unknown unknowns within process safety. Yeah, and undoubtedly, if the leadership isn't interested, if there isn't clear and positive leadership attached with process safety, then our behaviours as people working for those leaders will be affected, and it'll be affected in a negative way. Okay, so for them to be effective, for them to give this this commitment to do things right, they've got to have some level of involvement and competence, and of course convincing you that process safety is important to them. And when they've convinced you that it's important to them, then it will also automatically become important to you. And it sets up what's called the culture throughout the organisation that we'll look at in a short while. Now, in terms of corporate governance, you know, there is nothing new here either. Within the UK, we have what's called the Corporate Governance Code of Practice. It was developed in the noughties on the back of some financial scandals that went on in the UK. Yeah. But if you look at what's written down here, this is no different to what is considered effective best management practice. And already you can see, if you read through this table, you can see those 3 questions I've already posed to you about process safety management. That the leaders know about it, they're aware of it, and so on and so forth. One point, when I've undertaken training for in excess of 3,000 board members and senior executives across the process industries. And you cannot assume that those senior executives understand that first question of what can go wrong. I have done many of these training exercises where the senior executives have gone out and find out, and they've come back to me and said, you know, Andy, nobody ever told me that we could kill 500 people. We've written it down, we've put it in front of the regulator, but nobody's told me as the chief exec that we could do that sort of harm. Yeah? There's this assumption that they know as much as we do, having done the risk assessment and everything else. But this is just setting out what is effective good management practice for any aspect of any core value of a business. And essentially, although we've got this corporate governance here, we've also got in the UK what's called the PSLG guidelines. You can Google those to pull those up. The OECD in Europe has published guidelines. You can pull those up simply by Googling. They're very useful, but it's telling us the same thing. Apply effective good management practices to process safety because it's a core value. Because if you get it wrong, it can devastate a business going forward. Really, it's built around these cornerstones for governance, that we do understand what it is that we're playing with. And that's everybody, from the boardroom down to the operators and maintainers. We understand what can go wrong. We've got the information that shows us that those things are effective, in that we maintain them and operate them correctly and everything else. That we manage things according to what's required of the legislation, our own company standards, accepted good management. And of course, we keep this watchful eye. We're actually measuring performance. You know, when you think about how much an average company spends on incident and near-miss investigations and audits per year, it will be a staggering amount of money. And yet, if we don't use that information, it's essentially a waste of money. Yeah, we have got to use that information to make it better, to make things better. And this is your leadership, your cultural aspects. Yeah, the culture that we're all working together, because process safety isn't something you just give to the process safety manager. The same as occupational safety. Everybody's got a responsibility for it. Everybody's accountable for it. But without this, leadership is important. And leaders, you know, senior leaders, they set the roadmap. They set out what it is they want to achieve, and they need to take an holistic view. You will not get your senior managers to sit in on quantified risk assessments or permits to work or anything else. Those are givens, yeah, but they need to set the view of this commitment. We need to do things properly. And ideally, they need to aim for what I call value maximisation, not profit maximisation. So it's really linked to the sustainability of the business, not the short-term needs of the business. Yeah. And if they set the culture right, if they set the systems up that can really influence this performance, and we can see the business becoming a lot better, more mean, more efficient, more higher quality products made more safely and everything else, of course, which gives us a lot of benefits as a business. Yeah. But they need to take that longer view, because process safety is not something you can fix in an afternoon. It requires further work than what we normally give our management teams, who are very tactically focused, you know, goals and objectives for this year. whereas the leadership should be focusing on goals and objectives for a period of years going forward. There is actually an initiative that was started in the UK pre the pandemic, so it's sort of stalled. But there is a lot of behaviour where, there's a lot of delegation goes on. The leaders assume that the right things are being done, but don't necessarily get so heavily involved that they can say, I know they're being done and I know it's being effective. So there is a UK initiative where the health and safety inspectors from the HSE are planned to go in and inspect the behaviours of the senior leadership teams, to hold interventions with the CEOs of companies and so on, and essentially asking them, what are you doing as an individual to progress process safety, to make your business better from a process safety perspective? And these documents here give the sorts of questions they will be asking, and they expect that, well, they won't allow the CEO to have, the group health and safety manager in the meeting with them and so on. They expect the CEO to know. So you can see how it's really raising the ante on process safety leadership principles within the UK. And undoubtedly, as things go on in time, that'll spread more globally, and it already is starting to spread more globally. But it all points down to this thing called culture. So what I've given you here is what's the HSE's definition of culture, and it's a bureaucratic organisation, so you get a very bureaucratic answer. It's correct. It's very true. I much prefer the second one. How the organisation behaves when no one is watching. Because what we want is people to do the right things. People understand why they're being asked to do things in certain ways. Why is it important? Because if you do it wrong, you might end up with a very large fire or something like the Beirut explosion or whatever. That even when nobody's watching, they still do the right thing. So we're getting into people's behaviours. Yeah, and that's what culture is. Culture is based upon people's attitudes to it, and it's based upon their behaviour. But of course, these are difficult things to measure. If you're an organisation that likes to have actions because that prompts you to do something, it's very difficult to give some actions to improve people's behaviours. It's very difficult to write down some actions to improve people's attitudes, and hence it's difficult to get culture. It's a long time thing. But the inputs to culture are these three things on the left. We've got to have the good systems and processes. Well, what's that mean? You will have your management systems, your health and safety management systems, which will have all the headings that you'd expect them to have, that you look after your assets, that you do risk assessments, that you have a permit to work system, and so on and so forth. But again, these need to be effective. And they'll only be effective if they're implemented well, if people follow what the procedures require. And again, if the behaviour of the leadership is to do things quickly and sideline these things, then the procedure's not being implemented properly. And we know there's been lots of work done which has looked at businesses, all manner of businesses, and those that have good, workable, well implemented management systems end up with better outputs in all manner of different output parameters, whether that's quality, profitability, or indeed health and safety. But armed with that, we've also got to have good targets and objectives. Targets and objectives that everybody in the business is aware of and everybody agrees that they are achievable. Okay, so we're not suddenly deciding to go from £1 million profit up to £15 million profit in 1 year. Yeah, because people won't believe that that's achievable unless you're doing something completely out of the ordinary, like buying up a company or whatever. Okay, and then an awful lot of coaching and mentoring. And this is starting to happen, but it's starting to happen in what I'll call a negative way. There are a lot of companies that are working on the system of what's called safety observations or whatever. People have targets, managers have targets to go out and do safety observations, to go out and see people doing jobs, watching jobs, making sure they're doing the jobs properly or whatever. Okay. But the reason why I say it's done very negatively is they go looking for somebody doing something incorrectly and then going in and dealing with that. There's not a lot of positive action of looking for somebody who's doing something correctly and going out to find out why are they doing it that way. Okay, because with all of these systems, you know, it audits, performance monitoring, safety observations, whatever tools are being used, we need to make the improvements. We've got to have an outcome from it. This will make it work. This will make things go better. And a lot more can be achieved by this coaching and mentoring. And that is the difficult aspect of it. Because everybody in the business needs some element of coaching and mentoring. And those that provide the coaching and mentoring, they need to have specific training in providing coaching and mentoring. And it's almost, you know, an infinite loop that we keep going round and round. But it's all aimed at understanding what are people's behaviours. Are they aware of what can go wrong? Okay. Now, one good way of getting this, in my experience, which is starting to happen, is the use of bow ties. I'm not going to go into detail of what bow ties are, but bow ties is a visual representation of essentially what can go wrong in certain steps of the processes and what barriers you've got. So by definition, on a bow tie will be all the important pieces of equipment and tasks and a good understanding of what could ultimately happen if these barriers fail. And therefore they become something that if they're used, and I've seen these used in companies where they laminate the bow tie and they stick it out by where the people do that operation. Okay, and the training that the people are given is focused towards all those elements on the bow tie. Yeah, so it almost becomes a checklist for people to work to, as well as a procedure. It keeps it in the forefront of their mind of what could go wrong and what they've got to protect them. And of course, it's also a good starting point from an auditor, because that's the important stuff on a bow tie. So if there's a barrier there, the auditor can go and make sure that it's been designed appropriately, that it has been inspected and maintained according to a schedule and done properly, and so on and so forth. So very powerful things, but it's all trying to build up this culture. What you will find though, if you look at the guidance out there for process safety, when we talk about culture, a lot of it's built around people's behaviours and hence their competence. It differentiates between individual competence and what's called organisational competence. So the ability of the organisation to keep going forward, managing the risks. Okay, and when it comes down to it, it's all down to the people. And you will find that somebody somewhere knows either consciously or subconsciously what the risks are. I would be able to take a room of your people and say to them, you've got your management system, which bits of the management system work well? And you'd be able to tell me which bits don't work well. And that'll be known. People will say, well, the management of change doesn't work very well because, or the permit to work system doesn't work very well because. What we're weak at is taking that intelligence and fixing the problem. Yeah. So it requires us as an organisation to have that competence to start up with the people within the business at all levels, and it's a lot about engaging with your workers. listening to them, talking to them, understanding their awareness. Can you have a good solid conversation about the risks with your operators and your maintainers? So there's a lot of work there. Yeah, it's no longer good enough to say, well, for this job we have a we've got a description of the work that the person does, a job description, and we've got a training matrix that says these are the courses and this is the training that they should have been gone on. That's no longer considered acceptable. Competence these days is more than just skills, knowledge, experience. Attitudes has crept in, people's behaviours again. You know, you may know how to do it properly, you may have done it properly many times before, but today you just can't be bothered to do it properly. You can't be bothered to go and get the correct tool and so on and so forth. So there's a lot more emphasis on competence assurance, somebody going out, having meaningful discussions with people doing tasks, doing work, and finding out about their awareness of the hazards and the risks, their awareness of the measures that are in place and everything else. It's a lot tougher ask. Yeah. And really where the leadership comes in, it's against this, what I call this holistic view versus the silo mentality. Many of us, and we set our businesses up that we all sit in silos. Yeah. I'm the process mechanical engineer. I'm only interested in mechanical engineering. Yeah. We need process safety cannot be managed satisfactorily like that. Somewhere within the organization, there has got to be somebody who looks at the whole view. And this is your leadership, this is your management, where they're looking at the whole system, that we're acting on the information that we're getting, that we're making things better. You've also got to remember that almost as a species, we don't like change. Change is enforced on us. None of us really wants change. But you think about your own sites, how change happens constantly. For the sustainability of the business, change has got to occur. But most of us don't want to see change. Most of us don't focus our mind to change. If you remember back at the start of this, I talked about process hazard analyses. And we're happy to accept the norm rather than look for improvements. And think about it, your people will know which things don't work well. And if there's an auditor comes in on the site, what do we do? What's the practice on your sites? It's very typical that we sweep those problems under the carpet. We try and hide them. We say things like, make sure the auditor doesn't see this. Yeah. We're not accepting change. We're not in continuous improvement mode. If we don't find the gaps in our systems, in the ways of our working, we will not improve them. We'll live with them, and eventually they will come back and bite us. So the focus has got to be on finding the gaps. So when an auditor is due, we don't just say, well, go out and do your audit. We say, we know there's problems with this aspect. Go and delve deeper into that to find out why we've got those problems and tell us how we can improve that situation. That's the behaviour we should be expecting of our auditors. But very often we set ourselves up to, oh, well, we want the auditor to tell us that we're good. So if we tell the auditor that's what we want, that's what he'll give us. Yeah, we've got to work differently. We've got to find these gaps. And really, what I'd like you to take from this is a change of attitude. And when you go to work in the morning and you turn up at the site gates, you kneel down and you say, I want to find the problem. I will not be satisfied today if I don't find a problem. Because if I find a problem, I can fix it and things will get better. Yeah. Too long have we gone on living with the problems. We know where the problems are. The people on your sites will know where the problems are. We're just not dealing with them. Yeah. We're not taking that action. We're not trying to fix things. How many times when you fetch a problem to a manager, does the manager say, don't fetch me problems, fetch me solutions? That's basically saying, go away, I don't want to know about the problems. Yeah, I just want things to go tickety-boo and keep going on. So we've got to start looking at it from the point of view of looking at it as a whole system, untangling this bag of string and trying to draw conclusions from it. Now, just to finish off with my last slide, there is a philosophy, a new sort of piece of work that's been done, which is specifically aimed at how what's called high reliability organizations should work. And high reliability organizations are those organizations that are innately risky. So they've got significant hazards that can do a lot of problems. And what this philosophy says is if we can fully define what can go wrong, we truly understand what can go wrong with our processes. This is a system that requires proactivity. Yeah. So we put a lot of effort into proactively understanding what can go wrong, putting in place the measures to deal with those things proactively, not waiting until something's happened and then fixing it, but proactively understanding and taking that learning, whether that's learning from our own audits, performance measures, or in fact, the bad things that have happened to other people. So we've got this learning orientation, every opportunity to learn, to improve. This should mean that we should have very few problems that we don't know about. We can anticipate the problems that could happen on our sites, and we've solved them. We've put in place measures to deal with it. So if something bad does happen, we should be able to contain it a hell of a lot quicker and a lot more effectively. Coupling that with a just culture. So what do I mean by a just culture? I mean a culture where the standard is set and everybody works to that standard. And if people stray from that standard, they're dealt with in the same sort of way. Yeah. So if you dismiss an operator for doing something, if the CEO did exactly the same thing, the CEO is dismissed as well. Yeah, it's a just culture. It's not a blameless culture. It's a just culture. And we have mindful leaders. So what's a mindful leader? It's a leader that keeps it at the forefront of their mind that significant bad things could happen within the business, and they don't want it to happen. They never want it to happen, and therefore they keep the focus on making sure that these very unlikely events, we don't just keep our fingers crossed and think, well, it's very unlikely to happen, therefore, you know, I've got a day job to do and I'll carry on because I've got more important things to do. They keep that focus, and they keep asking people to report issues and to report gaps, and they build their business to identify these gaps as well as provide the resources and so on to be able to fix those gaps. So I'm ending there. Hopefully what I've said gives you some food for thought of the sorts of issues that I've come across in my lifetime doing process safety and some of the big nuts that still need to be cracked. If you want any help on these systems, Sigma-HSE is here to help you on any of these sorts of aspects. There's tools and techniques that we employ to get a grip on these things, and we've got the experience of things that we've tried and tested that have worked throughout a wide range of process industries. So you know where we are if you need to follow up on this, ask any questions or whatever. So on that, I hope you've enjoyed your time, and thank you very much for attending, and I'll see you again in the future, hopefully. Goodbye.